He would be driving down the street and he would see a woman and he would look at her and he would say, "You're next."
It's become a risk to the public health, but as it's wiped away from the world, demolition teams cannot remove the memories of what has gone on inside.
Prosecutors say it contained Naso's graphic notes from the crimes he committed. Naso is a former photographer. He was charged and now convicted of murdering 4 women.
They say time softens a person, but for these elderly killers, age only made them more dangerous. Some played the frail old man act in court, while others showed no remorse at all. But one, Robert Durst, the real estate heir worth millions, accidentally confessed to murder while wearing a live mic, whispering chilling words that sealed his fate forever. Let's dive in.
He wasn't trying to get away with anything. Did it in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, in front of her children.
Some criminals never change, no matter how much time passes. Albert Flick was in his mid-70s, a frail-looking man who had already spent decades behind bars. The system believed he was too old to kill again, so they let him out. But just 2 years later, he proved everyone wrong. In broad daylight, on a busy street, he committed a brutal murder, the same way he had killed before. And when the courtroom doors closed on him for the last time, there was no sympathy left. Albert Flick had a dark history of cruelty against women. In 1979, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison for stabbing his wife, Sandra Flick, to death in front of their children. After serving his time, he was released, but within a few years, he was right back in prison for attacking another woman. Despite his criminal record, a judge in 2010 decided not to give him another long sentence, arguing that Flick was too old to pose a threat to society. He was freed yet again. That decision would cost an innocent woman her life. By 2018, Flick had become obsessed with 48-year-old Kimberly Dobby, a mother of twin sons. She had no interest in him, but Flick refused to let go. He stalked her, watched her every move, and even followed her to a homeless shelter. Then, he made his final, calculated move. On July 15, 2018, outside a laundromat in Lewiston, Maine, Flick launched a vicious attack. In broad daylight, with bystanders watching, he stabbed Kimberly Dobby 11 times in the heart and neck, just feet away from her twin sons. Security footage captured the horrifying moment as Flick continued stabbing, even after she collapsed. Witnesses screamed, but it was too late. Kimberly bled out on the sidewalk as her children watched in horror. Flick was arrested on the spot. His defense? He knew he was too old to go through another rejection, so if he couldn't have Kimberly, no one could.
It took the jury just 45 minutes to reach a verdict.
Find him guilty.
The one word Dobie's family and friends wanted to hear.
During his 2019 trial, prosecutors showed how he had planned everything, even buying a set of knives days before the attack. The jury took just 40 minutes to convict him of murder. At 77 years old, Flick was sentenced to life in prison. There would be no second chances this time.
That was the miscarriage of justice. He should have never been let out in the first place. If they would have kept him there, Kim would still be alive.
Kimberly's family was devastated, knowing that this tragedy could have been prevented. And the public? Outraged. The justice system had ignored the warning signs, allowing a known killer back onto the streets. Albert Flick's release cost an innocent woman her life. But the next case is even more unsettling. Joseph Naso kept detailed journals of his crimes, revealing a sinister pattern that went unnoticed for decades.
Joseph Naso started today. He is the man charged with murdering 4 young women and dumping their bodies on the side of the road. Cameras were allowed in court for the beginning of this trial.
A quiet, elderly man, a retired photographer, and a serial killer hiding in plain sight. Joseph Naso, a former freelance photographer, had spent decades traveling across the United States, seemingly blending into society. But when police searched his home in 2011, they found a diary, one that detailed horrifying crimes spanning decades. The pages told the chilling story of a meticulous predator who kept photos, keepsakes, and handwritten notes about his victims.
Prosecutors say it contained Naso's graphic notes from the crimes he committed. Naso is a former photographer. He was charged and now convicted of murdering 4 women.
For years, authorities had struggled to solve a string of murders dating back to the 1970s. The victims had something unusual in common. All of them had first and last names that started with the same letter. This bizarre connection led investigators to nickname the crimes the double initial murders. But without a suspect, the case remained unsolved. That all changed when Joseph Naso was arrested in 2011 for violating probation on a minor theft charge. When officers searched his home, they uncovered a nightmare in writing, a detailed crime diary describing horrific killings. The journal included descriptions of how he overpowered women, locations where he left their bodies, and even photographs of some of his victims. Despite his age, 77 years old at the time of his trial, Naso remained cold and defiant in court, even acting as his own attorney. During the trial in 2013, the prosecution laid out overwhelming evidence, including DNA, handwriting analysis, and the disturbing contents of Naso's diary. Naso insisted he was falsely accused, arguing that his diary was nothing more than fictional stories, and that the women in his photos were merely models. But the evidence spoke for itself. The jury found him guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, and due to the aggravating nature of the crimes, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. At 79 years old, Naso was sentenced to death in 2013. He showed no remorse, instead blaming the victims for their own deaths and claiming the justice system was corrupt. With California's moratorium on executions, Naso now sits on death row, living out his final years in a prison cell, rather than the quiet life he had once manipulated so well.
But it was a very emotional time. Can you at all explain why and how it was?
It's reliving your whole life all over again. Every time you had to take a moment to think about this, you were thinking about all the things he's taken from you.
The families of the victims wept in court, reliving the horrors they had endured for decades without answers. Some expressed relief that Naso would never walk free again, while others wished he had been caught sooner before he had the chance to take so many lives. Joseph Naso's gruesome diary revealed his crimes, but the next case is even more disturbing. Anthony Sowell, known as the Cleveland Strangler, left an entire neighborhood in fear as authorities uncovered something unimaginable inside his home.
It's become a risk to the public health, but as it's wiped away from the world, demolition teams cannot remove the memories of what has gone on inside. Sowell entices a woman into his home. Whether they live or die is up to him. How many times will he rape? How many times will he murder before anyone can get inside the mind of a serial killer?
In 2009, a disturbing smell lingered through Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. Neighbors complained for months, but no one imagined what was really causing it. Behind the doors of Anthony Sowell's home, police discovered something that would haunt the city forever. A house of horrors, hiding one of the most shocking serial killings in recent history. Anthony Sowell, a former Marine, had managed to blend into society despite a disturbing past. To outsiders, he was just another middle-aged man, living a quiet life in his Cleveland neighborhood. But inside his home, he was harboring a gruesome secret. The horror unraveled when one woman managed to escape his house and ran straight to police. What officers found when they arrived was far worse than anyone expected. Bodies buried in shallow graves in the backyard, decomposing remains inside the house, and evidence of more victims who had vanished without a trace. The stench the neighbors had complained about for months. It was the unimaginable truth: death, hidden in plain sight. Sowell was arrested, and an extensive investigation revealed he had been targeting women for years. His victims were mostly women from vulnerable backgrounds, many struggling with addiction or homelessness, people he believed no one would notice missing. Police found the remains of 11 women inside and around his home. Some were hidden in garbage bags, others buried in the backyard, and some were simply left inside the house to decay. At trial, Sowell showed no remorse. He sat in court, stone-faced, as prosecutors laid out the gruesome details of his years of terror.
Every time he started to put the extension cord around my neck.
From behind?
From behind.
Then what, if anything, did he do with that extension cord?
He squeezed it as tight as he could to where I couldn't breathe.
In 2011, Sowell was convicted of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and neglect. The jury wasted no time handing him the ultimate punishment: death. But justice came in a different form. In 2021, before his execution could be carried out, Sowell died in prison at age 61 due to a terminal illness. He never faced the lethal injection that his victims' families had waited for.
Dick Ambrose read guilty 82 times. Inside the courtroom, victims' relatives gently but anxiously rocked back and forth as that verdict was read, then shared hugs before leaving the courtroom. Murderer Anthony Sowell.
The families of the victims sat in court weeping as they listened to the unimaginable details of what their loved ones endured. Some were furious that Sowell was never executed, feeling he escaped true justice. Others, however, saw his slow death behind bars as a fitting end. trapped in the very type of confinement he had forced on so many others. Anthony Sowell's crimes left a city shaken, but the next case involves a wealthy real estate heir who thought his money and power could keep him above the law. For decades, Robert Durst evaded justice, even as bodies piled up around him. But his final mistake? Confessing on a hot mic without even realizing it.
They are the 5 words everyone is talking about this week. Killed them all, of course. Is it possible that when he uttered those words, Robert Durst was confessing to 3 murders? And could the list be even longer?
For decades, Robert Durst lived as a wealthy, eccentric real estate heir. But beneath the luxury was a trail of death and deception. His name was tied to multiple disappearances and murders, yet he always managed to escape justice. Until a hot mic confession in a documentary changed everything. The mystery surrounding Durst began in 1982 when his wife, Kathleen Durst, vanished without a trace. Investigators suspected foul play, but without a body, Durst walked free. Years later, in 2000, his best friend and confidant, Susan Berman, was found shot in her Los Angeles home, just days before she was set to talk to police about Kathleen's disappearance. Then came the most shocking twist. In 2001, Durst, disguised in a wig and dress, was arrested in Texas for killing and dismembering his neighbor, Morris Black. He claimed self-defense, and incredibly, a jury acquitted him of murder despite finding Black's body parts stuffed in trash bags. Durst had money, power, and a chilling ability to evade justice. But what he didn't realize, his own words would ultimately bring him down.
Kill them all, of course.
In 2015, the HBO documentary The Jinx aired its final episode. And in an unthinkable moment, Durst, not realizing his mic was still on, mumbled to himself in the bathroom, "What the hell did I do?" Killed them all, of course. The FBI arrested him the next day. At trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a man who killed to silence anyone who knew too much. The evidence was damning. Durst's handwriting matched the anonymous note sent to police about Berman's murder, and witnesses described his paranoid and erratic behavior leading up to her death. After decades of escaping justice, the verdict was in. In September 2021, Durst was found guilty of first-degree murder for killing Susan Berman. A month later, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But his downfall didn't stop there. Just weeks after his sentencing, prosecutors in New York charged him with Kathleen Durst's murder, finally giving her family a shot at justice.
New York real estate heir Robert Durst has been charged with the murder of his former wife. Kathleen Durst was last seen in 1982 and declared dead in 2017. Her body has never been found.
Durst sat in court expressionless, a frail, sickly man in a wheelchair, barely reacting as the judge handed down his life sentence. The victims' families, who had spent decades waiting for justice, broke down in tears, some in relief, others in disbelief that it took this long. But the final twist: Durst died in prison just 4 months later, leaving behind a legacy of mystery, murder, and unanswered questions. Durst's case was shocking, but the next one is just as disturbing. A notorious serial killer known as the BTK Strangler terrorized his community for decades, until his own obsession with attention led him straight into the hands of law enforcement.
He was the most heinous serial killer Kansas has ever seen.
He would be driving down the street and he would see a woman and he would look at her and he would say, "You're next."
For over 3 decades, the BTK killer terrorized Wichita, Kansas, stalking, binding, and strangling his victims. The name BTK stood for Bind, Punish, Kill, a title he proudly gave himself in taunting letters sent to the media and police. Despite his twisted need for attention, Dennis Rader lived a double life: a devoted family man, a church leader, and a respected member of his community. No one suspected the monster hiding behind the mask, until his own arrogance led to his downfall. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader claimed 10 victims, carefully plotting each attack and taking disturbing souvenirs from his crimes. Then, he suddenly went silent, seemingly vanishing without a trace. For years, Wichita lived in fear, but without any new murders, the case grew cold. Then in 2004, everything changed. On the 30th anniversary of his first known crime, Dennis Rader couldn't resist the urge to remind the world who he was. He sent a letter to a local news station, reigniting the hunt for the city's most notorious killer. What followed was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where Rader believed he was in control. But he was wrong. Rader's biggest mistake came when he asked police if they could trace information from a floppy disk. Detectives lied, assuring him it was safe. He mailed it in. Within hours, digital forensics led police straight to him, his real name, his church, and his home address. On February 25, 2005, after 30 years of evading justice, Dennis Rader was arrested.
Broke into the house and waited for her to come home.
This is the statement of a sadistic murderer.
Were you armed with a handgun at that time also?
Yes, I had a handgun.
What happened when you came back?
I actually had 2 handguns.
In court, Rader showed no remorse, delivering a cold, detailed confession of each crime, as if he were reading a shopping list. His lack of emotion stunned the courtroom, especially as he described the terrifying moments before his victims' deaths. Despite his guilty plea, the judge gave him the harshest sentence possible, 10 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would die behind bars. The families of his victims sat in the courtroom, shaking with anger and grief, while another survivor of his attacks said, "You are nothing." But the most chilling reaction, Rader sat emotionless, only breaking his silence to complain about prison food and his lack of access to a television. A serial killer who thrived on attention was now trapped in solitary confinement, forever silenced. Up next is Dorothea Montalvo Puente, a seemingly kind-hearted landlady whose boarding house hid a dark and sinister secret.
Let's get him out of here. Mr. Montalvo, what can you tell us about the murders? Are you involved in any way? Excuse me.
Dorothea Puente, 59, operated a boarding house in Sacramento, California, where she took in elderly and vulnerable individuals. However, authorities later discovered a dark secret. Some residents never left. In 1993, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. By the late 1980s, several of her tenants had mysteriously disappeared. Some were never heard from again. Others, well, their final resting place was much closer than anyone imagined. Dorothea Puente had built a reputation as a kind-hearted caregiver. She was known in the community for her generosity, donating to charities and helping the less fortunate. But behind the warm smile and grandmotherly demeanor, Puente had a dark secret. She was murdering her tenants and stealing their social security checks. Her victims were elderly, mentally ill, or had no close family to look after them. She took advantage of their trust, harming them and secretly burying them in her backyard. For years, she got away with it. But when social workers started asking questions about a missing tenant, the truth began to unravel. In November 1988, police arrived at Puente's boarding house to investigate the disappearance of Alvaro Bert Montoya, a mentally ill tenant who hadn't been seen for weeks. Puente gave her usual story. Bert had simply left. However, detectives weren't convinced. They decided to search the yard. What they found would shock the nation. As they dug, they uncovered human remains. First one body, then another, and another. In total, police discovered 7 victims buried in Puente's backyard. Investigators later found that each had been given harmful substances before their identities were hidden beneath the soil. Puente, calm as ever, watched the police work. When they asked if she could step outside for some air, she agreed, then vanished. She fled to Los Angeles, where she tried to blend in among the elderly at a bar. But her face was now plastered all over the news. A man recognized her and called the police. Just days after her escape, Puente was arrested. Her victims were people who depended on her for care, people she saw as nothing more than paychecks. Once she had gained control of their Social Security benefits, she got rid of them, ensuring the checks kept coming while no one asked questions. Her method was simple but deceptive: give them harmful substances, take their lives, and bury them. Then she would continue cashing their checks, forging signatures, and deceiving authorities. Puente was charged with 9 murders, though she was convicted of 3 due to a hung jury on the other 6. In 1993, she was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 15 years. She spent the rest of her life behind bars, never admitting to her crimes. Additionally, she showed no remorse for her act.
That the defendant, Dorothea Montalvo Puente, did commit multiple murders, to wit, at least 1 crime of murder of the first degree and 1 or more crimes of murder of the first or second degree, to be true.
Even in prison, she maintained her innocence. She insisted she had only taken in those who had nowhere else to go, that she had never harmed anyone. Dorothea Puente died in prison in 2011 at the age of 82. Her house on F Street still stands, a chilling reminder of the horrors that took place inside. It's terrifying to think about how easily trust can be manipulated. Puente wasn't some masked killer lurking in the shadows. She was a sweet-looking old woman, someone people turned to for help. Her victims were some of society's most vulnerable, people who should have been protected. Instead, they were betrayed in the worst way possible. Our next case is a wrongful conviction that took decades to correct, all while a murderer remained in the shadows.
I know you'll never forgive me, but I don't know what else to say. No, it's not right. I'm sorry.
On June 13, 1996, the small town of Idaho Falls, Idaho, was shaken by a horrific crime. Angie Dodge, an 18-year-old woman, was found brutally murdered in her apartment. The case baffled investigators, and with no immediate suspect, pressure mounted to find the killer. For over 2 decades, the case took unexpected twists, resulting in wrongful convictions, advanced DNA investigations, and ultimately, justice. 6 months after the murder, investigators focused on 20-year-old Chris Tapp. Initially, he was questioned to provide information about other suspects, but the questioning soon turned into an intense interrogation. For over 100 hours, Chris was pressured, manipulated, and fed details about the crime. Despite no physical evidence linking him to the murder, he confessed under duress. In 1998, he was convicted of aiding and abetting Dodge's mistreatment and murder. His sentence? A minimum of 30 years in prison. Chris later recanted his confession, claiming he had been coerced by detectives. The case was reviewed in 2007, and experts determined that his confession was unreliable. But it wasn't until 2017 that his mistreatment conviction was vacated, and he was released after serving 20 years behind bars.
Entertain Chris's claims of innocence. They used deception and false evidence. They falsely told him that he failed polygraphs, that the machine was saying that he was lying.
Then investigators continued searching for the real killer. In 2014, a breakthrough seemed close when authorities used familial DNA searching. They found a partial match to a man named Michael Usry Sr., whose DNA was in a public genealogy database. His son, Michael Usry Jr., a filmmaker from New Orleans, was now under suspicion. His travel history to Idaho raised even more red flags. Detectives brought him in for questioning, collected his DNA, and anxiously waited for the results. When the test came back, it was negative. Michael Jr. was innocent. The police had the wrong man yet again. With all leads exhausted, investigators tried one last approach in 2018. This time, they used a powerful forensic tool, autosomal familial DNA searching. The results led them to a man named Brian Lee Dripps Sr. Dripps had lived across the street from Angie Dodge at the time of her murder. Investigators followed him and collected a discarded cigarette butt. When they tested the DNA, it was a perfect match to the crime scene. Brian Dripps was arrested in 2019. After extensive questioning, he finally confessed. He claimed he had been under the influence that night, intending only to hurt Angie, but things got out of control, resulting in her tragic passing. After 23 years, the real killer was behind bars. In February 2021, Brian Dripps pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison, but would be eligible for parole after 20 years. But still, he had no guilt for his actions.
Of investigation, Idaho Falls detectives identified Dripps as a suspect through DNA evidence.
Meanwhile, Chris Tapp, who had spent 2 decades in prison for a crime he didn't commit, was fully exonerated in July 2019. The case of Angie Dodge highlights how Chris Tapp lost 20 years of his life. Michael Usry Jr. faced public scrutiny for a crime he had no connection to, and Angie's mother, who fought for years to uncover the truth, lived with the pain of knowing justice was delayed for so long. For now, Angie Dodge's family can finally find some closure, knowing the man responsible for her death is where he belongs, behind bars. Our next case is even more unsettling. A man who posed as a caregiver, but was in reality a cold-blooded serial killer.
Police bringing Billy Chemirmir in for questioning after they say they witnessed him dispose of a jewelry box belonging to 81-year-old Lou Harris outside his apartment.
For years, families in Dallas, Texas were left devastated and confused. Their elderly loved ones had passed away under mysterious but seemingly natural circumstances. Many of them had been healthy, active, and showed no signs of illness before their sudden deaths. At first, these cases didn't raise suspicion, but in March 2018, everything changed when 91-year-old Mary Bartell survived an attack and revealed shocking details about what had been happening. Her testimony led to the arrest of Billy Chemirmir, a caregiver turned serial killer, accused of murdering at least 22 elderly women. Billy Shimirmir moved to the United States from Kenya in 2003, working as a caregiver and car salesman. But behind his quiet demeanor was something far more sinister. He posed as a maintenance worker, healthcare professional, or caregiver to gain access to elderly women's homes. Once inside, he smothered them with a pillow, making their deaths appear natural. Since there was no obvious sign of struggle or trauma, these murders went unnoticed for years. It was Mary Bartel's survival that finally exposed the truth. On March 20th, 2018, police arrested Billy Shimirmir. When they searched his apartment, they found an alarming piece of evidence: a red jewelry box filled with items belonging to multiple deceased women. This discovery connected him to numerous suspicious deaths, leading authorities to reopen several old cases. Shimirmir's first trial in 2021 ended in a mistrial due to an 11-1 jury deadlock. But in 2022, during his retrial, he was convicted of capital murder. What drove Billy Shimirmir to commit these horrific crimes? Authorities believe his motive was financial gain. He stole valuable jewelry, cash, and expensive belongings from his victims, selling them for profit. His actions were calculated. He specifically targeted wealthy elderly women who lived alone or in upscale retirement communities, believing no one would suspect foul play.
All right, next. Yes, guilty. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Guilty.
Yes.
In 2022, Shimirmir was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. However, prosecutors choose not to pursue the death penalty, leaving many victims' families feeling that justice was incomplete. He showed no shame for his act. Even in prison, Shimirmir could not escape the consequences of his actions. On September 19, 2023, he was killed by his cellmate. The case of Billy Shimirmir is one of betrayal and horror. He was a caregiver, someone trusted to protect and care for the vulnerable. Instead, he preyed on them in their own homes, taking advantage of their frailty and loneliness. For the families of his victims, his death in prison brought some closure, but it could never erase the pain he caused. The daughter of one of the victims said, "This man didn't have the peaceful passing. There is some relief in the feeling that he didn't get off easily." His story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, sometimes disguised as the very people we trust the most. Our next case reveals a grandmother's unspeakable crime that shocked an entire nation.
Now, those charges include first-degree murder and felony child abuse in the death of her 8-year-old granddaughter, who she was the legal guardian of at the time.
It was an ordinary afternoon when doctors at Nash UNC Healthcare in North Carolina were faced with a heartbreaking situation. An 8-year-old girl was brought into the emergency room with serious injuries. Despite all efforts, she was pronounced dead upon arrival. Authorities from the Nash County Sheriff's Office quickly arrived at the hospital to investigate. Their search led them to a home on Dutchman Road in Nashville, North Carolina, where the little girl had been living with her 72-year-old grandmother, Patricia Ann Ricks. At first, the cause of the girl's injuries was unclear. However, as detectives gathered more evidence, a heartbreaking truth emerged. Patricia Ann Ricks had mistreated her granddaughter, leading to severe harm. Tragically, no one realized the extent of her suffering until it was too late. The young girl wasn't the only child in the home. Several of her siblings also lived there, under Rick's care. Authorities soon arrested Ricks and took her into custody. However, when questioned about what had happened, she remained silent. She was charged with first-degree murder and felony child mistreatment. She was held without bond in the Nash County Detention Center.
I have found some of those, but we're not currently going to release that at this time. Some weapons or items were used as weapons at the residence.
2 years later, at 74 years old, Patricia Ann Ricks appeared in court. She was told she would receive a mandatory life sentence for her actions without the possibility of parole. "It was an accident when it happened," she said. "I love all of my grandkids. I took those kids in because their parents didn't want them." Her attorney, Phil Lane, supported her, saying, "She gave these children a home so they wouldn't end up in foster care. She had always been a caring grandmother." The case shocked the entire community. Detective Sergeant Kevin Bissett admitted that the tragedy led to major changes in how child welfare cases are handled. For the young girl, these changes came too late. She lived in a home where she should have been safe, yet suffered in silence. Her story is a reminder that children deserve love, protection, and care, and that we must always be watchful for those who need our help. Our next case is one of pure brutality. A man whose rampage left a trail of devastation from one city to another.
A strange Pennsylvania vehicle in the driveway, correct?
Yes.
And he's telling you my friend Paul is there.
Yes.
Can alarms go off in your mind at that point?
Yes, they did.
On a quiet day in 2007, the small towns of Texas were shaken by a series of brutal murders. What seemed like random acts of violence were, in reality, the calculated killings of a man with a dark past, Paul DeVoe. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a man on a deadly mission, leaving behind a trail of devastation that stretched across multiple states. At first, his crime seemed unrelated, but soon the truth unraveled. A cold-blooded killer was on the loose. It all started with the senseless murders of two teenage girls, 15-year-old Haley Faulkner and 17-year-old Danielle Hensley. They were innocent, full of life, and had no idea that their paths would cross with a man like DeVoe. He showed no mercy. Their lives were taken in an instant. But this was just the beginning. DeVoe had already claimed other victims before that tragic day. He was also accused of killing 41-year-old Michael Allred at a bar, his ex-girlfriend, Paula Griffith, and her 48-year-old boyfriend, Jay Feltner. His killing spree didn't stop at one town. He traveled across the country, leaving behind grief and terror in his wake. DeVoe fled Texas, but his rampage wasn't over. On his way to New York, he ran into car trouble. That's when he killed his final victim, 81-year-old Betty Jane DeHart. He shot the elderly woman and stole her car, continuing his escape. With 6 victims spread across multiple states, law enforcement agencies sprang into action. The Texas Rangers, the FBI, and local police worked together to track DeVoe's movements. Forensic evidence placed DeVoe at multiple crime scenes, and witness testimonies painted him as a dangerous fugitive. His stolen car was flagged by authorities, and investigators traced him to Long Island, New York, his hometown. The FBI alerted local police, and a multi-agency task force moved in.
The first statement that I heard him make was, do you know how many bodies they found? 5, 6 in Texas, maybe 12 bodies.
When DeVoe was finally caught, his trial became one of the most chilling in Texas history. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors painted the picture of a man who thrived on violence, who had spent his entire life hurting people without remorse. The jury didn't take long to decide his fate. In less than 20 minutes, they found him guilty, and after just 3.5 hours of deliberation, they delivered their final verdict. Paul DeVoe would face the death penalty.
A man accused in a cross-country killing rampage was sentenced to death Thursday for the murders of 2 teenage girls.
However, he remained stone-faced and silent. But what made this case even more chilling was DeVoe's reaction. While the families of his victims poured their hearts out, expressing their grief and anger, DeVoe sat silently. No remorse, no apology, just a blank stare. His defense tried to argue that he didn't have a history of causing trouble in prison, but prosecutors shut that down quickly. The evidence is overwhelming, they said. He has a lifetime of hurting people, threatening them. For the families of his victims, his motive didn't matter anymore. All they knew was that their loved ones were gone, and no explanation could bring them back. On sentencing day, emotions ran high. Parents and relatives of the victims addressed DeVoe directly. Robert Faulkner, Haley's grandfather, didn't hold back. The day you are executed, we will be there to see justice done for our children, and we will find peace in the fact that you will never hurt anyone again. But DeVoe remained emotionless. Even as his own family wept in the courtroom, he showed no sign of regret. Paul DeVoe's story is one of pure evil. He was a man who killed without hesitation, leaving behind families forever broken. The pain he caused will never fade. For the loved ones of his victims, it wasn't enough to bring them back, but at least they knew he would never harm another soul again. The elderly criminals in this video may have thought they were untouchable, but their sentences proved otherwise. Their courtroom reactions, their fate, and their downfall will never be forgotten. But there's more. The next video on screen dives even deeper into cases that left judges speechless and families reeling. Keep watching.